Okay, hello and welcome to the fifth lecture in this European macroeconomics course. So where do we stand? Overall, the idea, the whole course is to compare the two main macroeconomic theories, to show how they are designed, to show what implications are caused by these designs. And of course, the most relevant implications are the implications for macroeconomic policy. And macroeconomic policy has two main players, the central bank and the finance ministry, monetary policy and fiscal policy. And we have already discussed quite a bit of macroeconomic stabilization policy. And the main difference between the real approach and the monetary approach concerns, of course, how the government and how the central bank shall deal with macroeconomic developments. And one can simplify it in a way by saying, in the real classical paradigm, the best thing the government and the central bank can do is to do nothing, to remain passive, because this model designs the economy in a way that the economy is self-stabilizing. And if it is self-stabilizing, there's no reason for macroeconomic policy to interfere with the system. And whenever the central bank or the finance ministry tries to become active, tries to do something, it is not a solution to the problem, it's a problem for this inherently stable macroeconomic system. And this view is reflected by two main approaches to macroeconomic policy by the classical, neoclassical model. For monetary policy, the most direct implementation of this theory is monetarism. Monetarism was mainly developed by Milton Friedman in the 1960s, 1970s. And I have shown you the quote by Friedman, who says, the best thing monetary policy can do is just to target a constant growth rate of the money stock. It doesn't matter how you define the money stock, but just target it, do not change it, remain passive. So that's the message of the classical model for monetary policy. And for fiscal policy, there's a similar approach. It's so-called Ricardian equivalence. And we discussed the model by Barrow. And the idea of Ricardian equivalence is also quite simple. If the government reduces taxes and raises money for these taxes with a deficit, the households do not use the additional income to spend more, because they know in the next period, when the government has to repay the debt, then taxes will be higher. So there is no reason for the households to shift their consumption from today's consumption to tomorrow's consumption, or vice versa, because they know they have to pay for the lower taxes today with higher taxes tomorrow, and therefore the government and fiscal policy do not have an impact on the expenditure of the economy. So this is a kind of laissez-faire approach which characterizes the classical model. And now you can contrast it with the Keynesian approach. And the Keynesian model, and I think we have discussed this, has the feature that once the economy is affected by a negative demand shock, there's a tendency for the economic system to remain in an equilibrium with a lower output, an equilibrium which is associated with unemployment. And this, of course, then necessitates that fiscal policy and or monetary policy become active in order to get the economy out of this negative situation, out of this situation where you have unemployment. And so in the Keynesian approach, monetary policy and fiscal policy have a very important role to play. So in the Keynesian model, fiscal policy and monetary policy have a very active role to play. It's their task to get the economy out of an equilibrium on the goods markets, which is no full employment equilibrium. How can this be done? We've discussed last week the role of monetary policy and the channels which the central bank can use to stimulate aggregate demand. And in this very simple model, the channel is investment, private investment, and we assume that private investment depends on the interest rate. We additionally assume that the central bank can control the interest rate that is relevant for private investment, and just by lowering the interest rate, the central bank can boost investment expenditures, and investment expenditures boost aggregate demand, and by this, the economy can be moved back towards a full employment equilibrium. And I've shown you a chart where one can nicely see for the United States how the Federal Reserve, by changing the interest rate that it controls, the so-called federal funds rate, how this interest rate tries to control the economy. So in situations when aggregate demand is very high, situations where we had high and also increasing inflation, the central bank increased its interest rates and thus caused a recession, and this cooled down the economy, and the other way around, when the economy is affected by a negative demand shock, the Fed lowered interest rates, stimulates investment, and bring it back to equilibrium. So, and now we have a second player, fiscal policy, which also has an important role to play in macroeconomic stabilization. And now the question is now, what are the channels by which the fiscal policy can control aggregate demand? And you will see these are more direct effects, while monetary policy indirectly, via the interest rate, affects aggregate demand. Fiscal policy can directly affect aggregate demand either by increasing government expenditures, that's one way to do it, and the other way is by changing the tax rates, by changing taxes. And now let's have a look how this, so this is finance mystery, and if you go to Berlin, you can see it's quite impressive. It's a typical Nazi building style of the 1930s, and it was the Reichsluftwaffenministerium, Ministry for the Air Force, when it was built. Okay, so let's talk about fiscal policy, and we discuss first the mechanics of government expenditures, and then we will talk about the mechanics of cutting taxes. Okay, let's have a look at this graph. We start here in this position, and this is a situation where aggregate demand is at a level which is insufficient to secure full employment, because full employment output is 8, and now we have taken the parameters of the model in a way that aggregate demand is insufficient to generate full employment. We have an equilibrium with unemployment. The question is, how do we get out of it? How do we get from this blue point to the red point? How do we can do that? And now the idea is the government has now the ability to increase aggregate demand. So far, we assume that aggregate demand only consists of investment and consumption. This is just consumption investment. So far, in this situation, we assume that government expenditures are 0. So far, the government has not become active. Now, what can the government do to bring the economy to the full employment equilibrium? Well, the government must increase its expenditures. So far, they are 0. And now they have to increase it from 0 to 1, and we can see that here on this chart. Now they have increased aggregate demand because we have 1 unit of government expenditures. And the interesting result is, by increasing government expenditures by 1 unit, you get an increase of aggregate demand and increase of the equilibrium output by 2 units. little mystery. So government spends, let's say, 1 billion of euros, and as a consequence, the equilibrium output increases by 2 units. And this is so-called multiplier effect, which characterizes the Keynesian model. So when you're spending money, the final effect on equilibrium output is more than the 1 unit that the government spends. And yeah, where does this come from? What's the logic of this model? Well, in order to understand the model, one has to know, and we've said that before, that aggregate supply always equals aggregate demand, and aggregate demand fully determines aggregate supply. So that's the logic. And now, if the government increases aggregate demand, for instance, by purchasing investment goods, the firms producing investment goods increase their supply by 1 unit. There's an additional supply produced. The idea is now this additional supply by the investment good producers means that the workers in this sector have additional incomes. And the model assumes that all the money goes to the workers, so we do not differentiate between profits and wages. So the idea is when there is an additional demand for investment goods, and when they are produced, so that the production adjusts to the demand, there will be more money in the pockets of the people of the investment good producers. Now the multiplier logic comes in, because now the people working in the investment good sector can use their money immediately to spend it and to buy consumption products. So that's the multiplier logic. So the money does not stop once government has paid the bill for the investment goods. No, there's then more money in the pockets by the workers in this industry, and they use the money immediately to spend it on consumption goods. I think that's the logic. So the process does not stop. When the government spends the money, there's second round effects, and now the people in the investment goods sector spend the money on consumption goods. They do not spend it 100%, because the model assumes that households only spend a part of their income, depending on the propensity to consume. In our model, we assume that the households spend 50% of their income and save 50% of their income. This is a little bit high, but we just use these parameters to make it simple. So normally the saving rate is about 10%, so the consumption rate, you can say, is about 90% or sometimes higher. But here in our model, we assume it's 50%. So if these investment good producers have now 1 billion euros more in their pocket, they save $500 million, but they spend the other half. And this means for the consumption good producers that they increase now their production for consumption goods by $500 million euros. And that means that in this sector now also there's an additional income. There's more money in the pockets of the people who work in the consumption goods sector. And then again, we assume that the people working in the consumption goods sectors, when they have more money, they also buy consumption goods. And so this is a kind of iterative process where the initial effect of more government spending gets multiplied. And that's why we call it multiplier process. Of course, it's also a kind of theoretical approach, because in reality, maybe it doesn't work so simple as we've described it. But I think the important thing to know is, of course, that the money circulation does not stop. So it's kind of circular flow where whenever money comes to households, they use it to spend it. And this creates more demand, creates more incomes that are spent again. So I hope that you somehow got this message. I think we probably don't even need to explain the table in too much detail, but the idea is when we start here with one additional unit of government expenditures, aggregate demand increases by 1 unit from 6 to 7. And out of this 7, 50% are consumed with 3.5. And so we have the initial effects. We have one unit of government expenditures increases aggregate demand and increases consumption. And so in the next period, we have this additional consumption. So our aggregate demand increases now by an additional 0.5%, which then means that out of the 7.5, we have more consumption, again 50%, and so on and so on. So that's a little bit the logic of this approach. And at the end of the process, you can see that given the 50% propensity to consume, 50% propensity to save, the effect of 1 unit additional government expenditure is an increase of aggregate demand by 8. And it means that this 2 increase by 2 units means 1 additional unit, which is the initial effect of government expenditures, and 1 additional unit of private consumption, which is the multiplier effects due to the higher government expenditures. Okay, so that's nice effect, which means that governments can be very effective, and we'll talk about the empirical values of the multiplier soon. Let's then look at the second instrument which the government can use to stimulate demand. And of course, this is the instrument of tax policy. Government can increase taxes, can reduce taxes in order to stimulate demand, but it can also use higher taxes if the economy is in a situation of overheating. So in order to discuss this, we have to change our equation for aggregate demand. And we have now aggregate demand, we have here the taxes. And we assume that aggregate demand now is made up of autonomous consumption here, of the incomes that people earn, minus the tax, times the propensity to consume, plus investment, plus government expenditures. And for simplicity, we assume here that the tax is just a fixed amount that the private sector has to pay. It's a tax that is independent of the income, and we do this just as a matter of making things as simple as possible. Now we take numerical values in order to show the whole thing. So we assume that A is 2, we have 0.5 or propensity to consume. We assume that the tax is 1, and we assume that investment is 1 and that government expenditures are also 1. And adding this up, we get here an equilibrium of 7. Again, this is not equilibrium with full employment. So now it's the task of the government to stimulate the economy, in this case now by reducing taxes. And as we have assumed, value of taxes of 1. The only thing that the government can do is reduce this tax, and we assume for simplicity that it just reduces the tax from 1 to 0. And then we can see what's happening. When the tax is reduced, our aggregate demand shifts upwards in both cases. And it shifts upwards by half a unit. And this is due to the fact that if the households have to pay 1 unit taxes less, they save 50% of the 1 unit, and the other 50% they spend, and so aggregate demand goes up by 0.5, and this is this upward shift of the aggregate demand curve. And we see here now that that with a higher aggregate demand curve, we get a new equilibrium, we get our full employment equilibrium, and the equilibrium output increases by 1 unit. And so we see, wow, that's not the same story as the story with the additional government expenditures, because in the case of expenditures, 1 unit of additional expenditures bring 2 units additional equilibrium output. And here we see 1 unit of lower taxes just brings the increase of aggregate output by 1 increase. So the multiplier is just 1. The question is, why is this the case? What explains the difference? And it's relatively simple. So the initial impact of the lower tax on output is just 50% of what the government has in form of lower incomes. Sorry, the initial effect of the reduction of taxes by 1 million is only half a unit on output, because 50% of the lower taxes are just saved by the households. So while with government expenditures, the initial effect is a full 1 unit on aggregate demand, in the case of the taxes, the initial impact is only half a unit. And then from this half a unit, you can again have the multiplier effect, so that in sum, you get 1 unit out of this 1 unit of lower taxes, but you don't have multiplier that exceeds 1. So we can see that in order to stimulate the demand, government expenditures have a stronger effect because of this initial impact, which has a full effect on aggregate supply, while in the case of lower taxes, the initial impact is already in the first round, it's just only half of the money that the government has to use to stimulate the economy. Okay, so, and we can now look at empirical data for the multipliers for spending and for tax policy. And we have here a table from the IMF. And you can see that the spending multipliers are relatively high, and you can also see that they depend on the economic situation. So if the government spends more money, if you have a full employment situation with a high capacity utilization, the multiplier is not so high. Why? Well, if the economy is already overheated, if the government spends more, it's very likely that the central bank becomes active. Central bank realizes, wow, now we have inflationary tendencies, and then the central bank very often increases taxes. The higher taxes, of course, have a negative impact on the economy, and so this diminishes the impact of fiscal policy on the economy, and it also diminishes the effect of the multiplier. Therefore, we can see that in recessions, the effects can be relatively high. Of course, there are all kinds of different analysis, and also for different time periods, different countries. But I would say overall, you can see we have in many cases spending multipliers that are higher than 1. For the revenue tax multipliers, fortunately, we don't have so many data, but one can see they are positive. For the data available, they are positive, but they are less than 1, which is in line with what we have seen. So yes, spending is more effective than taxes. What is interesting, and this is table 5 that you can see here, is that the effects of fiscal policy are much higher once the economy is in the situation of the so-called zero lower bound. Zero lower bound means that the central bank has already reduced the interest rates to 0. So more or less, there's little else central bank can do. And in this situation, which is then very often a situation where the output gap is still very negative, but the central bank cannot contribute to increasing output. In this situation, one can see that the multiplier of fiscal policy is relatively high, so with values from 3 to 7, 2.3 or 4, and you can see compared to the non-zero lower bound, the multipliers are much higher. Okay, so far on fiscal policy and monetary policy in the Keynesian model. We can now go on to a topic that is related to fiscal policy, very much related to fiscal policy, is the role of government debt. So what effects have fiscal policy activities on the capital market? How are fiscal deficits financed? These are very important questions, and in the standard textbooks, they are very often not explicitly addressed. They're somehow addressed, but normally the question, how does fiscal policy finance higher government expenditures or lower taxes in the Keynesian model? How is this financed? This question is in standard textbooks not addressed. They somehow assume that the government can do it without creating higher interest rates, which would then be counterproductive. But this question is not really discussed in much detail. So what textbooks discuss is the effect on government debt within the theoretical framework of the classical model. This is something you find in textbooks, and this is also something we will start discussing. And I want to present you how in Menkyo's very popular textbooks, government debt and government deficits are described. And in this textbook, government deficits are discussed only from the perspective of the classical model. So the other approach is simply not mentioned, so that somehow as a student you must have the impression this is the only way how government deficits work. The main implication of this presentation is that there is always a crowding out of private investors if the government finances expenditures or lower taxes with deficits. So this is, in this model, this is an implication that always holds. And so let us see how this result is derived. So in Menkyo's textbook, but also in other textbooks, the role of budget deficits is discussed within the classical model of the financial market, the loanable funds model, from which we know that it is also a goods market model, but it's normally not mentioned. But so here, this classical model is used to describe how government deficits impact on the economy. What is also very important in this textbook presentation is that it is more or less implicitly assumed that government uses the deficit just for consumption, not for investment. This is a feature you can find also in the more complex models of government debt, that in all of these models, it is assumed when the government goes to the financial market, borrows funds, it uses the funds for consumption. And so what is discussed is mainly government deficits as an instrument of a transfer between generations, between consumers. So the government itself does not use it. It's just an instrument for transfers between different groups of the populations, most of the cases between older and younger generations. And the interesting case, and I think the most relevant case just today, that the government tries to invest more, wants to invest more, for instance, to do something to stop the climate change, to do all kinds of green projects and investments. This case is not discussed in all the classical, neoclassical models of government debt. So, what does now government deficit mean for our loanable funds model? Well, now we have to go back into this world of the all-purpose good. There's only one good that is available, and the idea is now, if the government runs a deficit, it means that it absorbs a part of the all-purpose good for the purposes of the government. And so the idea is, if the government takes away the all-purpose good from the households, they have less of the all-purpose good to supply on the financial market. That's really the idea. It's not really explained how the government takes away really the funds from the private household. It just assumes that somehow the government can take it away from the households, and in the as Mankiw states, when the government reduces national saving by running budget deficits, so whenever you have a budget deficit, there is less private saving, and you can imagine it somehow that the government goes to the household, takes away the all-purpose good from them, and so they have less of the all-purpose good to consume and also then to save. Then he says the interest rate rises and investment falls. We have this upward shift of saving due to the government's borrowing. And now, if we have here the initial equilibrium, now with the shift of the saving curve, so to say the supply curve of funds, then of course the interest rate goes up, and we have also in the new equilibrium we have less saving and less investment in equilibrium. That's bad. So no, and for the view of Mankiw, then the lower investment is bad for the economy and implies that economic growth will be lower. That's how a student who tries to understand the role of government deficits, budget deficits, that's what he or she gets. Wow, if the government runs a deficit, that's bad for the economy. Less investment, less growth. So better not to have budget deficits. And in Germany, this view is even enshrined in our constitution. German Grundgesetz, German constitution, says in Article 109 that the government is not allowed to run budget deficit in principle. There are exceptions in situations like a natural disaster or now like a pandemic. But overall, the main idea, the underlying idea of the German constitution is the German government should not run a deficit. And this is especially direct implication of this model, because you can see when the government has a budget deficit, it reduces national saving, the interest rate rises, investment falls, so better government don't do it. And so in the German Bundestag, there was a very large majority in 2009, and they decided we will have this in our constitution. So it's quite interesting. I must say, I don't believe that the members of parliament have all read Menkhu's textbook, definitively not. But this is exactly a case when some ideas are floated by textbooks, by some economists, and suddenly these ideas get a momentum of their own. And then they find their way into the constitution. And for Germany, this constitutes a major problem. Now, because once the pandemic will be over, the constitution says, well, yes, it's allowed to have deficits in years with the pandemic, and government deficits are very high, Germany this year and also last year. But then the logic of this debt break says, but all the additional debt, the pandemic-related debt, has to be repaid in an adequate period of time. And so this means for the next few years that the German government is not only not allowed to run a deficit, but in additionally, it has to create surpluses to pay down the debts that were caused by the pandemic. And so this debt break is really a break for growth, for investment in Germany. And we all know that the German economy, like many other economies, is confronted with huge challenges due to climate change, due to digitalization. And this needs a lot of public funds. Maybe it needs also a lot of public investment to deal with these challenges. And now in Germany, we have this debt break. And instead of investing in the future by raising money on the capital markets, and there's a lot of liquidity in the financial markets, German government is now forced to run a balanced budget and even to repay the additional debt that was created during the pandemic. So here you can see how such a simple chart with a somehow seemingly simple logic leads to huge policy consequences. And because if you don't get rid of the debt break in Germany, it's not clear how this will be possible. The German government cannot use the huge potential it has to invest in the future and to transform the German economy in a climate-friendly way, in a way that at the same time the competitiveness of our enterprises will remain high. It will not be possible because of these strange models who says when the government runs a deficit, national saving is reduced, the interest rate rises and investment falls. So this is kind of crowding out logic, which is in the minds of many politicians, and which then leads to very suboptimal results. In order to be precise, I want to mention that the debt break in the German constitution says that the Länder have to have a balanced budget, but the federal government is allowed to run a deficit of minus 0.5%. So little deficit is allowed for the federal government. Okay.
I received a question from a viewer. Aren't there also EU-wide budget rules like this?
Yes, very good question. And we will talk more on the EU rules once we come to fiscal policy in the EU. Yes, it's also due to the insistence of the German government that we have the Stability and Growth Pact. And the Stability and Growth Pact is extremely complicated, but the core idea is, in principle, governments should have balanced budget. Might be a slight deficit, but overall, it's a balanced budget that is required. So very good question, yeah. But the Stability and Growth Pact is not as binding as the German constitution. So but nevertheless, it's the same ideas, and the Stability and Growth Pact was created in 1996 on the initiative of the German government, because when the creation of the European Monetary Union came nearer, Germans were very much afraid of unsound fiscal policies, especially in Southern Europe, and so the Germans said, yes, we are willing to accept monetary union, but there need to be very stringent rules for fiscal policy. And so this is very a German initiative that has led to the Stability and Growth Pact. And yes, the core philosophy of the Stability and Growth Pact is more or less balanced budgets, no government deficits. So, and what is now interesting, you can, even within the framework of this classical model, you can show that such a negative outcome, that budget deficits lead to less investment, is absolutely unnecessary. You only have to change a little bit the assumption, and the key change that is required is to assume that the government uses the funds that it raises on the capital market not for consumption but for investment. And you see, this is also more realistic idea, and especially relevant now for the next few years that we have governments that have huge needs for public investment, also for infrastructure. And then let's see, even in the classical model, what happens. So if we assume that the government needs funds for additional investment, the logical way to show this in our chart is to assume that there's an additional demand for funds in the classical model for investment, and it means that our investment demand curve shifts upwards, so that the demand for funds increases, and there's no need to do something with a saving schedule. Why should it change? So the household save, and there's now with the government additional institution that demands funds for investment. In this case, you can see that the upward shift of the investment schedule leads to a higher interest rate and to a higher equilibrium of saving investment. You just have to change a little bit the assumption. And then suddenly you can see, yes, if the government wants to invest more, and if the government finances it on the capital market, yes, the interest rate goes up, but there will be an equilibrium with more investment. The logic is simple. If the interest rate goes up in the classical models, the households are willing to save more. They're willing to consume less in the current period, and this makes available the all-purpose good now for the government and for government investment. So, and now you would have a completely different picture already within this model. And it's really surprising that in the discussion, the theoretical discussion of government debt, this case, which is also a very realistic case, that governments want to invest, but they cannot finance it from current revenues, and they get the money from the capital market, that this case is not discussed. And of course, it leads to a completely biased and distorted view of government deficits, which then, as I said, have these very far-reaching policy implications. But what is important, of course, here in this approach, we have still, due to the assumptions of the classical model, we have a high interest rate, and we have also, of course, a crowding out of private investors, because there are some private investors who are at this higher interest rate no longer willing to invest. So we have a crowding out of private investors. Okay, so let's summarize it. The key features of the classical model. Due to the assumption of the all-purpose good, financing and investment are inseparable. And when the all-purpose good is used for investment, it can no longer be used as a means of finance. And that means when the government borrows funds, the funds are then used by the government and they are no longer available for investment. And so we have in this classical model always a real and a financial crowding out. And real and financial is due to the fact that in this classical model, real is financial. Okay, so I would say we make a break here and we will be back in 5 minutes. Thank you. So welcome back after the classical model and its representation of the financing of fiscal policy. We now turn to the monetary model. And when we discuss the monetary model, we also get into contact with something which is quite fashionable, which has become quite fashionable, and that is modern monetary theory. So what is modern monetary theory? If you ask famous Keynesian economists like Larry Summers, had been the Secretary of the Treasury for the United States, or Kenneth Prof, are really outstanding scholars in economics and Keynesian scholars. They have reacted with a lot of antipathy. So Larry Summers said, modern monetary theory is a recipe for disaster. And Kenneth Rogoff said it's modern monetary nonsense. And from Paul Krugman, you can also find similar comments. So what is modern monetary theory? Well, it's of course based on a Keynesian, on a monetary approach. Well, it's called modern monetary theory. And it discusses aspects of fiscal policy that are so far not very well discussed in typical textbooks, even when they discuss Keynesian models. And that is the way, how do governments finance expansionary fiscal policies? Where do they get the money from? That's something that is more or less neglected when you look into these textbooks. They show the mechanics of additional government expenditures or of lower taxes with models like you have seen it today. They don't ask where does the money come from. I must say, I also have presented these models quite often in my life, and I somehow had the feeling, well, maybe one should discuss where the money comes from, but it's not something that is explicitly discussed. And I would say the merit of this modern monetary theory is that it discusses the financing of government expenditures. And so what is modern monetary theory all about? I would say very good insight into the main ideas comes from the writings of Abba Lerner. Abba Lerner lived from 1903 to 1982, and his main ideas are presented in a relatively short piece that he wrote in 1940 something. 1943. It's called Functional Finance and Federal Debt. And so maybe we just read the main quotes from this paper. I think the first principle by Lerner is really important. It's simple, but it's important. He says, fiscal policy, expanding and taxing, shall all be undertaken only with an eye to the results of these actions on the economy and not to any established traditional doctrine of what is sound or unsound. So what matters is what are the effects of fiscal policy in the economy. And what he tries to say to us, be aware of some doctrines for which there is no empirical evidence. And maybe our German students can tell us about a doctrine of fiscal policy which has been very dominant until the outbreak of the pandemic. Can somebody of you give us this doctrine? Which doctrine has shaped the thinking of German politicians for many, many years?
The Black Zero?
Exactly, the Black Zero. think the black zero is a typical example of what Lerner has in mind when he talks of an established traditional doctrine about what is sound or unsound. And so this black zero is really a masterpiece, so to say, of a doctrine that has become a power of its own. So there was no more discussion whether it's good or bad to have government deficits and what the effects of government deficits on the economy are. The black zero got an importance of its own, and there were no longer any discussions. And so I think it's very, very wise from Lerner when in 1943 he didn't know about black zero, but that's exactly what he wants that's exactly what his warning is about. So then, second key message of Lerner is the responsibility of the government is to keep the total rate of spending in the country on goods and services neither greater nor less than the rate which at current prices would buy all the goods that it is possible to produce. Well, in this sentence, he more or less speaks of what we have discussed already quite a lot. In macroeconomics, it always matters that aggregate demand and aggregate supply are somehow in equilibrium. And that's what he wants. He says the spending would buy all the goods that it's possible to produce. So demand should be more or less in line with supply. And he says this is the key responsibility of the government to ensure that we have a macroeconomic equilibrium. And then also biologically says if total spending is allowed to go above this, there will be inflation. And if it is allowed to go below this, there will be unemployment. So far, this is relatively traditional. But what is now important for Lerner's view is if the government is confronted with a huge decline in aggregate demand, then it's a responsibility to fill this supply gap, and it's a responsibility of the government to increase demand. And what is now important for Lerner, if the money needed to finance these government policies is insufficient in terms of tax revenues, or if the government cannot raise it easily on the capital markets, then in theory, any excess over money revenues, if it cannot be made out of money hoards, must be met by printing new money. So that's the message. So if there is a huge decline in aggregate demand, if this requires huge government measures to bring aggregate demand back to equilibrium, then it is the responsibility of the central bank to finance this. And yeah, if you see the situation since we have the pandemic, it's exactly what's happening. So I will show you the figures soon. We have extreme government deficits, and for the governments, it would not have been possible to raise all this money on the capital markets. And so the central banks had to jump in and had to purchase all the government bonds that were required to finance the government activities. And so it was normally, it was not a direct printing of money, but more or less the central banks have exactly done what Lerner prescribes in its functional finance. And that's also the key insight of modern monetary theory. Key insight is for governments in large economic areas and large countries, there is no financial constraint for the activities because there's always a central bank who can help them out. But this non-existence of a financial constraint does not mean that governments can do what they want, that there are no constraints for the government. And this becomes obvious if you look at the second quote by Lerner. So when the government induces a spending that goes above the production possibilities, above aggregate supply, then it leads to inflation, and this the government should not do. So I think Lerner is well aware that even without a financial constraint for governments in large areas like the United States, like Japan, like the Euro area, even if they have no financial constraint, of course, there's always a real constraint. And we'll talk about this also in more detail, because what is interesting right now in the United States, we can say that the Trump administration, and I would say even more the Biden administration, are now very much behaving in a sense like advocated by modern monetary theory. So they do not pay attention to any financial constraints. You'll see they have huge deficits. The government debt increases quite a lot. But of course, the more programs that are now initiated by Biden, more transfers that are paid to the households, the more the US economy comes closer to a point where one has to ask, is the spending still compatible with the aggregate supply, with the production possibilities of the US economy? Okay, so how can governments finance their deficits in a monetary economy? So they do not have to borrow the all-purpose goods from households that then can consume less. No, they borrow money. And so where can governments get the money from if they want to finance huge transfers, as we can observe them today and also last year in the United States? Where can the money come from? And in a monetary economy, there are three different sources for financing government deficits: the central bank, the banking system, and the capital market. And we have to go through this a little bit because the effects are a little bit different. And in each case, we'll check, does this imply a financial crowding out of private investors? Okay, so let's start with the central bank. And for modern monetary theory, direct lending from the central bank, direct lending by the central bank is their preferred way of financing the government. Of course, this can be done. In the pandemic, we've seen this in the case of the United Kingdom, where the UK government had the ability to get money directly as a kind of overdraft facility from the central bank. So what happens if the government gets the money directly from the central bank? Well, in the first step, the government's account, the central bank goes up, and now the government uses the money on its central bank account to purchase goods, to make transfers to private households, and as a result, the bank deposits of the private households increase, so there's more money in circulation. And the higher bank deposits of the private households, or also firms who get subsidies from the government, are reflected in the balance sheet of the commercial banks, that the commercial banks have higher reserves with the central bank. So the direct impact of central bank lending to the government is you have an increase in the money stock M1, one can say, and also the banks have more reserves with the central bank. And so, obviously, the result is clear. Direct lending to the government means there are more funds. So there's no financial crowding out. On the contrary, private households, firms have more liquid assets. So what about borrowing from commercial banks? I think that's the way how governments finance their deficits today. So governments issue bonds, and in the first step, these bonds are purchased by the commercial banks. And in exchange for the bonds, the government is credited the money on its accounts with the commercial banks. And then, of course, the government has more deposits to the commercial banks, and then it makes payments to private households, to companies. The government deposits are reduced, but the deposits of the households and the corporate sector increase. So in some, direct lending from commercial banks, or if commercial banks purchase government bonds, means increase of the deposits in the central bank, means an increase in the deposits of the government and then also of the private sector. And again, we see there is no financial crowding out. What is important in this kind of financing, so if government issue bonds, commercial banks buy, then almost all cases, the commercial banks immediately sell the government bonds to the central banks who purchase then the bonds from commercial banks. This means the reserves of the commercial banks increase. And in the end, it's not so different from the first case, where there's a direct financing of the government by the central bank, or where the central bank directly purchases government bonds. But of course, in both cases, no financial crowds. There are more funds in the system. Then we have the third channel, the capital markets. So the government issues bonds, and one possibility is now that these bonds are purchased by people who have a lot of money on their bank accounts, who are willing to give up the liquidity of a bank deposit in exchange for a government bond, which in normal times, not today, but in earlier times, provided also an interest income. So of course, there's also the possibility that the government finances its deficits via the capital market. What are the effects on the liquidity in the system? Well, if people have money on their bank account, they purchase a government bond, and then of course the bank accounts of the private sector decline and the deposits of the government increase. But what is also important here now is that of course the government does not sell bonds in order to have more money on its bank account. No, the government of course uses the money immediately to make transfers to the private sector, to private households, or to purchase investment goods from companies. And so immediately the bank deposits of the government decline and the bank deposits of the private sector increase. So it's only a very temporary decline in the liquidity of the private sector. And so in the end, the funds within the private sector do not decline, even if the government finances a deficit on the capital markets, which means without the direct support of commercial banks or the central bank. And so the key implication of the monetary model is there is no need for a financial crowding out. On contrary, if the government is able to finance itself from the central bank or from commercial banks, additional liquidity, additional bank deposits in the private sector are created. I think this is an important insight of modern monetary theory, that there is no genuine financial constraint for governments. And of course, this is different in the classical model, where the financial sphere and the real sphere are identical by the assumption of the all-purpose good. So when the government gets the all-purpose good from households, and it uses this all-purpose good for I don't know what. It's not so really discussed at the moment, but if it uses this all-purpose good, it of course can no longer be used by the private sector. It's taken out of the system, and therefore, of course, due to this identity of the real and the monetary sphere, the real and financial sphere, in the classical model, there is always real and financial crowding out. And in the monetary model, we can see there is no financial crowding out. There's, of course, real crowding out. We've already addressed this, but there is no monetary crowding out. And I think one can very nicely summarize the whole thing by quoting Thomas Pelley, a very also well-known Keynesian researcher. And he says, the essence of MMT is that sovereign currency issuing governments, such as the US federal government, are financially unconstrained. That is because government has the power to create money to pay its bills, including its debts. Then he goes on stating the only constraint on government is the availability of real resources. It's exactly what Lerner had in mind. Say, okay, the government must take care that the spending does not exceed the production possibilities of the economy, because this will lead to inflation. But back to Palley said, if resources are available, government can buy them and pay for them by creating money. If they are not available, creating money to buy goods causes inflation. It is as simple as that. And what is quite interesting, it's the case of Japan. In Japan, you can see that the country has had huge deficits for almost decades, that the government debt level relative to GDP has been growing year by year and is now near 250% of GDP. And one can see, and we can also see, or one knows that the Bank of Japan has been buying tons of government bonds. There's no central bank that holds such a large stock of government bonds relative to GDP as the Bank of Japan. And we know that Japan has never had so far a problem of inflation. For most of the time, the country is near to deflation, and it has also so far not had a negative impact on the currency. So the Japanese currency has always been a relatively strong currency. In many years, it has been stronger than the government would have liked it. So, and now just have a look at fiscal policy in the COVID pandemic. And on the chart on the left side, you can see the fiscal balance of the United States and the euro area. And you can see how unusually high the fiscal deficits of the United States have been in 2020, and they will be also very high in 2021, even compared to the very high levels of deficits after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So it's really a huge stimulus provided by the US government. And you can see for the whole period that in the euro area, the fiscal stimulus has always been much lower than the fiscal stimulus of the Federal Reserve. So we can say in the pandemic, it's about 50% of what's happening in the United States. And this also explains why it's much more difficult for the euro area economy to get out of the pandemic in economic terms, why economic growth is much lower in the euro area than in the United States. And of course, one main explanation for this difference is the fact that the United States are a political entity. And in the euro area, we have the problem that we have a common currency, but we have 19 independent countries with 19 independent fiscal policies. And it's much more difficult to coordinate these different national policymakers to find a common approach to generate a fiscal stimulus that is really required to stabilize the economy. And this is an institutional problem, institutional flaw of the euro area, and we'll discuss this in more detail in the next weeks. And you can see that these huge deficits were financed by also unprecedented increases in the bond holdings of the Federal Reserve and the ECB. They've both increased their bond holdings substantially. And this means that more or less all the deficits that were required to stimulate the economy, to stabilize the economy, were financed by the central banks. So this is absolute clear example of how modern monetary theory has been applied during this crisis. It's quite interesting to see the difference compared with earlier crises. Because here, if you look at the time of the financial market crisis and the recession that was created by the financial market crisis in 2009, you can see that in this period, the ECB has more or less remained passive. The ECB had not been willing to buy major amounts of government bonds. And of course, this had the implication that it was very difficult for the member states of the European Union to get the money for their fiscal programs. And in my view, this is one of the main explanations why, after the financial crisis, the euro area was confronted with the euro crisis, because there were some countries, member states with relatively high debt levels, that were then no longer able to get the funds to finance their fiscal policy. And this created a crisis of confidence and to severe problems, and it could only be stopped by rescue programs where all the member states of the monetary union together were willing to raise the funds on the capital markets and then to give it to those countries that were no longer able to finance themselves on the capital markets. Okay, so then let's come back to Larry Summers. So is he right? Is modern monetary theory a recipe for disaster? And maybe look at what he says. He says here, as the experience of any number of emerging markets demonstrates, past a certain point, this approach leads to hyperinflation. And one can say, yes, this is true. Of course, if you misuse modern monetary theory, that can be a recipe for disaster. And there are, of course, countries, especially if they're relatively small, if their currency is not a global currency like the dollar, the euro, or the yen, they can have all kinds of problems if the deficits are very high, and of course this can also lead to inflation. But what matters, this matters not only for smaller countries but also for countries like the United States. It's always the dose that makes the poison. And that's why here the nice chart of Mr. Paracelsus, from whom we have the following quote: "All things are poison and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing that it is not a poison." And if Larry Summers talks about MMT and central bank financing of governments, it's the same way if you talk about alcohol. And I think there's no question that drinking alcohol excessively leads to terrible consequences. And the same applies to fiscal deficits. If you have excessive fiscal deficits, you finance excessive fiscal deficits with your central bank, then it will lead to a disaster. And so the important thing is, it all depends on the right dose. And I think critics like Summers or Rogoff, they assume that governments use fiscal deficits in an irresponsible way. And then, of course, you get all these problems. And so, when one talks about the negative consequence of MMT, I think there is no doubt. If you use it in excess, you will get all kinds of problems. But if you use it wisely, it opens you many options and offers you the ability to stabilize the economy without unnecessary distortions. And that's why the example of the euro crisis is so important. In this situation in 2009, the ECB was not willing to contribute to financing the government debt and deficits. As a consequence, it got all these very negative implications. In my view, they could have been avoided with an approach that is in line with modern monetary theory, and without any negative consequences in terms of inflation and so on. Okay, so that's important when one discusses the critics of MMT. They simply assume an excessive use of the instrument, an excessive use of all kinds of things has negative implications. And here you can see the consequences of excessive use. And here Samuel rightly says it results in a collapsing exchange rate. This would in turn lead to increased inflation, increased long-term interest rates, risk premium, capital fleeing the country, and so on and so on. Now, of course, if you do not use therapies in a responsible way, then you will create a lot of disaster. But the idea, if we make the comparison with medicine, of course, is to use therapies that are powerful, but to use them in a responsible way. Okay, I would say that we stop here. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. One question?
I think we got one question, or one participant wants to ask a question. With camera on.
Please.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes, could I ask one question? Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. I just wanted to know, like you said, that sometime modern monetary theory could fail and lead to hyperinflation. So could you give us some examples where that worked and where it hasn't worked in the world?
Yes, of course. Well, so in my view, so modern monetary theory works very nicely in Japan. We have really seen very high deficits for many, many years. They've seen debt levels growing, and Japan has the highest debt level relative to GDP of all the advanced economies in the world. And you can see no problem in terms of inflation. On the contrary, it's relatively it's relatively low, and there's also no problem with the exchange rate. But of course, we have seen in many developing countries situations where high government deficits have led to inflation. And I can give you as an example, I will go a little ahead. I just wanted to have it later on. So Venezuela is a case for a situation where the government deficit leads to high inflation. And how does it work? Well, the logic is, if you have a problem that the supply capacities in the economy are limited, and then if the government gives more money to the citizens and they spend the money, and then of course you get get higher prices, and if the economy is not very large, people also use additional money to import goods from abroad because many goods are not produced in your country. So get higher prices for domestic products, you get stronger imports, and of course these imports need to be financed. If this is not the case, then your exchange rate depreciates, and a depreciating exchange rate means that imports become more expensive. So you get additional pressure on the price level, upward pressure on the price level. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, it's more clear. It's about imports also. Yes.
And these imports, and of course, then there is some kind of dynamics in the system. We'll talk about this next 2 weeks, but it doesn't matter. We can also address it today. One problem is that once that people lose the trust in their currency, the feeling, oh, we have high inflation, and if we don't spend the money today, in 1 week, our money will only have 50% of the value of today, and when you have high inflation, this can happen. So whenever people get money in their hands, they spend immediately. So the so-called velocity of money increases also. So you get a kind of vicious circle of exchange rate depreciates more and more, drives the inflation rate higher. Same time, the velocity of money increases, and this altogether can then lead to hyperinflation. And so, yes, and of course, maybe it's also good that you address this point. I think very important condition for the applicability of modern monetary theory is that you have a relatively large country, a relatively large currency area, where it's not so easy for investors to get from the domestic currency in foreign currencies. So let's take Japan. In Japan, the interest rate on government bonds is zero since, I don't know, almost 20 years, I would say, more or less. And then one would think, and then why do Japanese investors not buy foreign bonds where they get higher interest rates? At least last 20 years, were relatively high interest rates on US bonds, also on German bonds. And then the problem, if you have a relatively large currency area like Japan, is that there are institutional investors, like insurance companies, who are forced by regulations to have a safe portfolio. These institutional investors are not allowed to invest in foreign currencies, in bonds denominated in foreign currencies, because then there's an exchange rate risk in these investments. And if you are required to have your portfolio safe because you're an insurance company, then you're also a little bit trapped. So you cannot get out of Japanese government bonds. And so this, of course, also explains that in a large currency area, you do not have to be afraid that investors will go out of your currency area, invest in foreign bonds. And this also requires that your currency is really a kind of global currency. And so then your domestic investors are trapped in this currency. Okay?
Yeah, that's a bit of information, but okay, I get it.
Okay, good. Thank you for asking. Thank you for using the camera. I very much appreciate if you interfere more in this way, because it's, you feel a little bit lonesome when you're standing here. Of course, I have Thomas and Lisa with me, so I'm not totally lonesome, but it's still a strange feeling to speak to an audience without seeing the people. So that's still difficult, and I think we all do our very best, but it's not ideal solution. So I'm very much appreciate if whenever you have questions coming up, please ask and use your camera, so then it's more entertaining for all of us.